As you know, we are enhancing and intensifying the Jewish education experience in our early childhood department. Some of you have children, grandchildren there. And of course, as the new school year starts, we immediately get to the High Holy Days and the story of Abraham almost sacrificing his son Isaac. Now, we're not allowed to teach that to little children anymore. When I was a day camp counselor in the previous century, telling small children about a father who was about to had a certain ameliorative effect, certain behaviors. But for better or worse, we don't do that sort of thing. So we concentrate on the question of the creation of the world. That's easier for kids to deal with. Physics, metaphysics, Big Bang, amino acids coming to life. The 2-year-olds really like that stuff. Of course, for the children, the image of creation that we saw in the reading earlier this evening, the creative reading for Mariv Aravim, which said there was chaos and God made order. That's nice. And yes, in general, we understand God's act of creation as being a creation where the Creator God acts upon the universe, creates the universe, and out of the waters, out of the chaos, creates some kind of order. And we would like to think that in creating order, God gave us an unmitigated and unalloyed, smooth path to salvation, whatever we mean by that. And it works for the little ones. But unfortunately, most of us have graduated from preschool. And we know that creation ain't quite as orderly as we would sometimes like to think it is. In fact, creation is kind of lumpy. Our tradition tells us that. Genesis chapter 1 has a story of creation. Genesis chapter 2 has a different story of creation. They sit there, canonized and sanctified, right next to each other, but they're two different stories. Then there's the stories of creation that we tend to forget, or perhaps we never learned. For example, in Genesis chapter 6, everybody's over 18, right? No? All right, don't listen. In Genesis chapter 6, gods, not one God, but plural gods, come down from heaven and have sex with women. Rabbi, you never told us that story before. If you had come to our high school senior seminar, I would have told you. And the product of those demigod unions are heroes, great, famous people. And still there's no particular order. There are different stories expressed. And even in the second generation of humanity, there isn't perfect order. There isn't unity. There isn't a glatt, smooth humanity. Adam and Eve's children, Cain is a keeper of sheep. Abel is a tiller of the soil. We know that their relationship was, shall we say, less than perfect, just as expressed in Oklahoma, where Rodgers and Hammerstein wrote the song that the farmers and the cowmen should be friends. And still in the 20th century, it was a problem. And then we get some other, these are what I call lesser-known biblical characters. There's a fellow by the name of Yaval. Okay, Cain kept what we call behemoth dakot, small animals, sheep and goats. Yaval took the next step, cows, big animals. But then his sibling Yuval, their parents were able to tell them apart, he didn't like dealing with the animals at all. He became a musician. Then came Tuval Cain, who was the first metallurgist. All within a few verses in Genesis. Already in the first couple of generations of humanity, there are different kinds of people. There are people of different occupations and different skills. People of different outlooks. People of different and various perspectives. Our reading of Noah's story tells us that Shem, Ham, and Yafet, his three sons when they came out of the ark, were of three different races. Which is a little interesting because they had the same parents, but the Lord's going to tell you it's the Bible. And that they went out and populated the world. And therefore, not only did everybody not think alike or have the same economic interests, but they didn't look alike either. And then, of course, the Tower of Babel story, which talks about many things, but tries to explain why we all don't speak the same language, even though we all may be speaking English or Hebrew. The rest of the Tanakh is filled with diverse stories. The book of Joshua talks about the Hebrews, the Israelites, conquering the land of Canaan after Moses' death, which we will read about in the Torah this Shabbos, or next Shabbos. The problem with the book of Joshua is there's two different stories there. Two totally different stories. One says the Hebrews marched in, took over, and, as it says in Hebrew, fartik. For those who don't speak the holy tongue, that means sova. Done. The other story says that the infiltration and the conquest of Canaan took decades and generations. There are two stories of the death of King Saul. One at the end of 1 Samuel, and the other at the beginning of 2 Samuel, sitting right there next to each other. Now, what's happened? What happened is that the world was not as well organized or as smoothly contained as as we would suggest in some of our prayers. Differences of interests, differences of opinion, and diversity are built in. And whereas most cultures and most people of the world insist on a seminal myth, insist on a foundational story of their faith that does not have contradictions and that presents one unified view of where their people came from, we Jews have never been like that. We have always recognized that there were differences of opinion and perspective. In fact, we recognized it so well, and we continue to recognize it so well, that we enshrine those different stories and those diverse opinions next to each other, sitting there in our holy books. And it doesn't bother us. It's not a problem. As in the Bible, so for the rabbis. The Mishnah and the Gemara, which together are the Talmud, is unique in human literature in that it records the minority opinions. It tells you what? Well, maybe court systems do it too. But for us, our sacred literature has no need to be consistent. Eventually, in practical matters, in halachic matters, you have to make a decision and move forward. That's what politics is all about. Or at least what it should be all about. But we have no problem recording the minority opinions in the Talmud. And even when we become Western thinkers, and our rabbis write law codes, which are easier to read than the Talmud, even there, towards the end of the 16th century, our great Rabbi Joseph Caro, who was born in Toledo, that is in Spain, not the one near, Cedar Point. Sorry, Adam. Carolyn. And wound up in Sfat in Israel, writes a law code that reflects the customs of the Sephardic community. At the same time, a brother by the name of Moses Isserlis is writing his own law code. He's in Krakow in Poland, and obviously his law code represents the norms of the Ashkenazi, or the European Jewish community. So what happened? What did our tradition do? Within just a couple of years, and remember, there's no internet, this is all done by typesetting, right? Within a couple of years, you could not purchase a set of Caro's law code without at the same time purchasing a set of Isserlis's law code, because what our sages did was they took the spots where the two guys differed and they printed them both together. And it tells you as you read the law code, this is what the Sephardic law code is, and here's the other opinion, the European opinion. And they both sit there to this day. And every student of rabbinics, in fact, any student of basic Judaism knows that you can't read one without the other. So what does it mean? It means that we as Jews, our community was always open to a diversity of views and opinions. It meant that for one Jew to be right, the other Jew did not necessarily have to be wrong. A story. In Chicago for about 20 years, I was honored to be part of a group of rabbis and Catholic priests that met together, went away someplace, and met together for a few days each year. We got to know each other pretty well. We were sitting around a circle one night, and one of the rabbis raised Harold Kushner's book, Why Do Bad Things Happen to Good People? Many of you know the book. And I piped up and said I don't agree with Rabbi Kushner's theology, which I don't. And a couple of the priests kind of went a little nuts. Wait a minute, Denker is one of the leaders. So we stopped the conversation. And the rabbis explained to the priests that in our tradition, the fact that one may disagree over theology doesn't negate the other. Like in the Torah, like in the Talmud, like in the law codes, the two opinions sit there peacefully in dialogue with each other. There was one older priest who was sitting in the back, and we all thought he fell asleep. As we were having this discussion, he lifted his head and said, "I can't wait till we get there," and fell back asleep. We understand as Jews that openness to other ideas and consideration of other points of view is not just okay, but it's essential. Long before our forefathers brought forth on this continent a country whose motto was E pluribus unum, out of many one, Jews were teaching that to generations of our people. the idea that openness, the idea that dialogue, the idea that discussion, the idea that respect for each other was essential. The idea of trying to understand where the other person was coming from, even if you ultimately disagreed with them, was what God wants us to do. It's not the easy path. It's not the convenient path. In some ways, it would be easier if we had one story of creation, if we had one point of view in the halakha. We could have done that if we had holed ourselves up in communities, or even if the kingdom of Israel under David and Solomon had held themselves up and not done business or worked with anybody else, isolated themselves from the rest of the world. That would have been real easy. But where do you wind up? You wind up like Albania, Bhutan, Myanmar until a couple of years ago. Myanmar, formerly Burma, where as we sit here tonight, there are 400,000 Muslims who have been displaced from their homes and are the victims of genocide at the hands of the normally peaceful Buddhists. No, dialogue and respect for the other is not an easy path. But if the world is to survive, if we are ultimately to repair this world that God gave us, we as Jews particularly, as a light to the nations, and hopefully everybody around us, will understand that survival requires a certain agility of the mind and a certain openness of the spirit. To be sure, we have come to a point in our political life, and our political life in Israel as well, which we'll talk about tomorrow, where that's no longer the norm. When we are in dialogue and we see people's opinions who are not the same as ours, whether we're sitting around a dinner table having a cup of coffee or whether we're on television networks, our default is that the person who doesn't agree with us because they are either stupid or venal or insane. And we dismiss other opinions too easily. Before anybody starts thinking I'm talking about one political side of the street or the other, I want to remind you that I am the product of a mixed marriage. My father considered himself a Republican. I'm sitting with a student. I'm supposed to teach, guest lecture a class in a few weeks on diversity. So one of the students from the class came to see me to pre-interview me for this course. And the professor of the course is an interesting person, and I wasn't quite sure what she wanted me to do with the class and the time I'm going to spend with them. So I said to the student, I said, tell me what your class is about, because you've already been meeting for a couple weeks. And she says to me, she says, our class is about diversity. I said, okay, tell me what that means. And she said, well, this is a class where our goal is to prove that white colonialism is the source of all evil in the world. Now, parenthesis. The enemies of Israel, many of the enemies of Israel believe that and see Israel as a colonialist implant in the Middle East. Just keep that in mind. Anyway, we continued with our discussion. And she was clearly on the left wing of politics and was absolutely sure of everything she was saying. She knew that Donald Trump was nuts. She knew a lot of stuff. I didn't bother to tell her that in the mid-1970s, I ran the congressman's office in the district where the Trump organization transition from being home builders to mid-rise builders to high-rise builders. And while I did not know and don't know Donald Trump personally, I certainly was aware of him and his activities on a relatively close basis. She talked about some other stuff. Nowhere was she interested in hearing what someone else had to say. Even where there were points to be made to show her that she was wrong in her extraordinarily left-wing thinking, was she willing to listen? Because she knew everything. Now, while I know that is frequently a foible of college students and younger people, those of us who have reached certain ages realize that we know less and less as we get older. Nevertheless, it was that understanding. It's that understanding. And it's so within the Jewish community as well. We have this tendency to write each other off. We have one side which says that if you wear the wrong color kippah, you're no good. We have another side that says if you wear a kippah on the street altogether, you're no good. It affects us. It affects us. A bunch of us hopefully will be going to Israel in March, along with folks from Plymouth Church. We hope that you'll go on the website and sign up for the trip, because that's an effort to try to learn about each other, to teach each other, to get to know each other. Plymouth Church is a UCC church. It's a United Church of Christ church, which has taken anti-Israel stands. But why should that stop us from talking to them? We have to mature to the point in our Jewish lives and in our professional lives and in our public lives, our political lives, to the point where we can say, like that old priest said, we have to get to the point where we can see each other's point of view without negating the other. Pirkei Avot, the rabbis teach us, tzarich lekabel kol adam b'kaf zechut. We are required to receive every other person as if they were meritorious and they were right. The conversations can no longer start with "you're wrong" because you don't agree with me. The conversations have to start with "let me hear what you have to say." Twice a day, Jews are commanded to refer to creation. In the evening, Ma'ariv Aravim, we talk about God who rolls the light away for the darkness. And in the morning, we talk about Yod Zeror, we talk about God who creates the light. A universe that is not as smooth and not as easy to deal with than we would like to have it. A universe that from its very beginning contains diversity and difference. And so that's why, shortly after we refer to God's creation, we say, Shema Yisrael. Start out Israel not by speaking, but by listening. Shana Tova.